Welcome to another great conversation on Think Radio presents Think Planet.
Think Planet is made possible by support from the Western Colorado University School of Environment and Sustainability, empowering future change agents to foster ecologically resilient, economically sustainable, and socially just communities throughout the world.
Become a Think Radio Presents partner at patreon.com, and you'll also get access to premium content you won't find anywhere else. Join us today. My guest today is ecologist and conservation biologist, Dr. David Inouye. Inouye is professor emeritus at the University of Maryland, where he has specialized in pollination biology and insect ecology for decades. Since 1971, he has spent his summers at the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory in the alpine meadows of central Colorado. In particular, Inouye's research focuses on the effect of climate change on high-altitude ecosystems. He joins me today from his home in Paonia, Colorado, to discuss a potentially alarming trend that's been euphemistically called in the mainstream media insectageddon. That is, a steep decline in insect populations in several locations around the world. What does that mean? And what can be done? David, thanks for joining me today.
I'm happy to be here.
You know, I think if we were to go back, say, 50 years and ask the average person, they might say that pollination biology sounds about as exciting as watching the corn grow, right? And maybe even less relevant to their daily lives. And yet, you know, you're a pollination biologist. You've written a book called Techniques for Pollination Biologists. But I think if we fast forward to today and we ask people that, even the most marginally informed person would have a hard time saying that pollination isn't a really important issue. Would you agree with that, that times have changed on this subject?
Yes, I think you're right. Times have changed. And I think one of the reasons, or some of the reasons that that's the case, is that there are now organizations that make it their business to try and make sure that people are aware of pollinators, are aware of what pollinators contribute to our economy and to our food supply. And I think that's working. So, for instance, one of the organizations I've worked with for quite a few years now is called the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign. And one of its projects several years ago was to try and get pollinators onto postage stamps. And that took a couple years. That's a long, involved process to get and propose a new postage stamp. But we were successful, and as a consequence, there were some pollinator postage stamps, and we're actually working on another project along those lines now. But it's those kinds of efforts, I think, that help bring to the public's attention pollinators and the problems that they face.
Well, that and the headlines that tend to be pretty alarming at times about the pressures that pollinators are facing now, which may have been true 50 years ago. That's just a random number, but let's say in the past, pollinators may have always faced certain pressures, but it seems to be ratcheting up now. Am I just sort of responding to alarmist headlines, or is there some truth to that?
I think some of each. There certainly are a growing number of problems that insects, including pollinators, face. And they're unfortunately not getting much better. They've been getting worse over the last few decades. For instance, the use of insecticides that we didn't really understand what problems they could cause for insects. So we're beginning to learn about that now. But those problems are growing. The human population is growing. Therefore, habitats are changing, and often in ways that are problems for insect populations. So the combination of loss of habitat, of increasing pressure from human-induced problems like use of pesticides, those problems are becoming worse and affecting insect populations, and people are becoming more aware of those problems and the potential dangers that they pose for human well-being.
Well, conspicuously absent from your list of pressures was climate change. Do you think that belongs in the list, or are insects having trouble adjusting to different climate regimes?
It does belong on the list, but I think maybe appropriately behind some of the human-induced problems like pesticides and loss of habitat. We do have some research from work that we've been doing at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab that shows that over the last, oh, let's see, I guess we first started some of these surveys of insects back in the 1970s. For instance, bumblebees, looking at what was the altitudinal distribution of different species of bumblebees. And we've gone back twice and are going to, again, this summer, repeat some of those surveys that we did back in the early 70s, showing that bumblebees are moving up the mountains, they're moving up in altitude, and we presume that that is a response to the changing climate. The fact that if they want to stay in their comfort zone, they've got to now move up in altitude. So we do know that as a local example, that's one way that insects are responding to climate change, uh, and
And,
there are many other examples as well.
and for instance, when you do see something like that, altitudinal changes, um, the way they're distributed on the landscape changes, what does that do to the ecosystem as a whole, to the food chain and so forth?
Well, the relationships between plants and pollinators have a long evolutionary history. And so there's been a lot of what we call coevolution, back and forth interactions, evolutionary interactions between, for instance, bumblebees and the flowers that they visit. And if, for instance, bumblebees are moving up in altitude, but they're able to do so much more quickly than the flowers that they're used to feeding on,
Uh-huh.
then they may have to find different flowers to feed on. And also, there was already a community of high altitude bumblebees that's up in the alpine tundra. And so, what's going to happen when these lower altitude bees move up into the alpine? Are they going to just push the alpine community to extinction? Or are those bees just all going to become competitors, and there'll be a lot more competition for floral resources? That's a question that we can't answer yet, but it does raise concerns for what's going to happen in the future.
Uh-huh. Well, and right now we're talking about bumblebees in alpine settings, but some of the more alarmist stuff that you hear involves food production and how shifting populations and even crashing populations of pollinators in some cases really does threaten large-scale food production. Do you find that that's true? Do you think that that's sort of one of those alarmist headlines that I was referring to? Is that justified? Are we really that vulnerable?
About a third or more of the food that we eat is brought to us courtesy of the service of pollinators. So, for instance, I had almond milk on my cereal this morning, and that almond milk was uh, produced from almonds that require pollination. And many of the other foods that I'll be eating throughout the day, and that everybody does, are brought to us courtesy of what's called an ecosystem service of pollination. And although in the case of almonds, we actually do pay for that service because the almond growers have to rent honeybee hives to come in and pollinate their trees.
Uh-huh.
In many cases, let's say in your backyard garden, when you are benefiting from the services of pollinators that are in your yard, you don't typically pay for that service. So it's been a free service, but we're beginning to realize how important that service is and some of the threats that the ecosystem service faces because of human activities.
Well, ecosystem services is one of the bullet points on my list of things that I wanted to talk about. So let's go there because you brought it up. That's sort of a new phrase, isn't it, in the lexicon of science and public policy?
It is. It's a phrase that in the scientific literature started maybe about 15 years ago, and it's taken a while for it to spread into to non-scientific use. But it's a very important concept. There are a variety of ways that we can apply it. So, for instance, people talk about the ecosystem service provided in terms of flood control. So natural ecosystems have the ability to absorb a lot of rainwater and to help prevent that water from creating floods. That might be one example. But with regard to pollinators, the ecosystem services is all those hundreds and thousands of species of bees and butterflies and moths and wasps that are out there pollinating flowers, and they're not being paid to do so, at least not by humans. They often are benefiting from the pollen and nectar that they collect. They need that to eat. But those ecosystem services are something that we're now realizing are very important for human well-being.
Right. And so the question really is how to account for those things and how to sort of build that idea into things like whether we develop in a wetland or whether we continue using a certain pesticide. Are you seeing that concept make its way into public policy? So like planners are trying to account for what is lost or gained with ecosystem services?
Yeah, it is. One example might be if a developer wants to build in an area that's a wetland, there are now some ways that they can mitigate that by helping foster wetlands in other areas to make up for the fact that that they may be destroying the ecosystem services produced by a particular wetland. They may be able to help um, replace those ecosystem services elsewhere. In terms of pollination, there are now estimates out there for how many billions of dollars a year are created or are supported by pollination of crops. And so when I go to the farmer's market and buy apricots and cherries and apples and pears, those are all benefited or benefits of that ecosystem service of pollination. And so you can begin to try and put a dollar figure on how important is that ecosystem of pollination. And it's in the billions of dollars a year on a global basis. Uh, but people have tried to estimate it for individual crops, for instance, just for almonds, let's say.
Uh-huh. Well,
So
let's
as
go
as
ahead.
people recognize that dollar value, that creates the incentive for generating legislation or policies that will help protect those pollinators that are producing that benefit. And so when I was a member of a group that wrote a report for the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. This is a UN-sponsored group, and about 2 years ago, we wrote a report about pollination and pollinators, and we actually wrote a special section specifically for policymakers, sort of an executive summary that would try and point out to policymakers how important is this service of pollination and why do they need to think about generating policies to protect pollinators, and what are some examples of policies that they could implement to create that protection.
Well, give us one. What is an example of something that could be done at that level?
Well, one possibility might be restriction of use of pesticides, either requiring that pesticide applicators get special training so that they can try and minimize the impact on pollinators. Another possibility, well, at the federal level, our previous president, President Obama, issued an executive order that mandated that all federal agencies start to think about what they could do to protect pollinator populations. And so now, for instance, there are a number of policies at national parks. There are a number of policies that the USDA is having to think about. But all federal agencies were told that they had to start thinking about policies to promote pollinators.
Well, that sounds like progress to me.
It
Let,
is.
let's shift gears just a second, because one of the things that I was particularly interested in, and I've referenced Alarmist headlines several times, but they seem to be coming fast and furious right now, on the issue of a decline in insect populations, not necessarily limited to pollinators. There have been several headlines, several studies released that suggest that the biomass, the total biomass of insect life in certain regions has declined by really large numbers. I mean, the one German study, for instance, 75%, 82% if you did it in the summer. Tell us what you know about that and put that into context.
Well, there are a couple of points I'd like to make about that. One is that this really demonstrates the value of long-term studies. So in the case of the German study, they had a few decades of data that they could then go back and look at and put hard numbers to how big is this decline. And in the world of science, long-term studies like that are difficult to carry out, in part because of funding. If you're fortunate enough to get a grant to do research from the National Science Foundation, it will typically support 2 or maybe if you're lucky 3 years of work. But given how variable insect populations are from one year to the next, for example, having 2 or 3 years of data is really a drop in the bucket, and it requires decades of data. We're fortunate that there is a program from the National Science Foundation that supports longer term research. They actually will give out grants for 10-year grants, a few of those. And we're fortunate that the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, we actually have one of those grants that we're using in part to support this work on looking at long-term trends in insect populations there. And another important point is that non-scientists can make important contributions here. That German study that you referenced was carried out by an entomology club. Most of the members of that club are not professional scientists, but they're interested in science, they're interested in insects, and they're willing to devote some of their free time to going out and doing that sampling on a regular basis, and then identifying those insects and trying to figure out what's going on. So there are ways that non-scientists contribute. Here in this country, there are programs like, there's one called Bumblebee Watch. There are also things like the 4th of July butterfly count. And so there are a number of ways in which non-scientists can make contributions to studies of insect populations that will help quantify what's going on.
Because
I'm old enough.
Going back
Sorry,
to
go
what you
ahead.
just said about a lack of long-term data, pardon me for interrupting you, but
Sure.
what that means is you tend to lack a baseline. So if we go out and
That's
we
right.
count tomorrow, we don't know what to compare that to.
That's right.
If we start
And
right now in some places, how long will it be before we could say one way or the other what's happening?
well, that's a problem that faces a lot of science because we wish we had started something a long time ago and had those data. In a few cases, what we're able to do is go back and look at museum collections and look at what was the abundance of insects or what time of year were insects collected. And we can go back and find that, bumblebee queens are appearing a lot earlier now than they used to by looking at the dates when bumblebee queens were collected in insect collections. So in a few cases, we can get some information about what was happening in the past, but that baseline information is very important. I'm involved now in a project that the U.S. Department of Agriculture is considering supporting. So I mentioned Obama's executive order, and there was actually last year, a study by the Government Accounting Office to find out are federal agencies obeying that mandate. Fortunately, it's a mandate that has not been rescinded by the Trump administration. And they did an audit of the USDA and told the USDA, you're not complying sufficiently with that executive order. And so they're under the gun now to do something. And one thing that they are thinking about supporting is establishing a national monitoring program for bees, not just bumblebees, not just honeybees, but all bees. And the only species for which we really do have some long-term data are for bumblebees, which are not even a native bee here in North America. So it would be very valuable for us to be able to start collecting baseline data for the thousands of native species of bees that we have here in North America, most of which we know very little about.
And we have a lot of anecdotal evidence, but I know that in the scientific world that doesn't count for much. Like I grew up in South Texas where the fireflies were thick, and you go back today and they're just gone. Is it possible to account for that kind of stuff in these calculations? Where people who say, yeah, on a trip to the lake, it used to be that your windshield was you needed to wash your windshield 3 times on the way,
Right.
but that's not happening anymore. What do you do with that sort of stuff?
Well, unfortunately, that a lot of that is anecdotal. I'm also old enough to remember back when uh, cleaning the windshield on my drive from the University of Maryland out to the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab every year was something that we had to do quite regularly, and it actually wasn't until that German study came out and some other studies came out that I began to think about the fact that, oh, I really don't have to clean my windshield as often as I used to. Um, and I have to admit, it was kind of neat to see fireflies hitting your windshield because of the fact that they would glow as they got squished on the windshield.
Yeah, as brutal as that sounds, it was part of our childhood, right? It was,
Right.
but that's not. It's really interesting to me that changes like this on this scale just sort of go unnoticed a lot of the time. It's as you said, you didn't even think about the fact that you weren't seeing the same number of insects, or that now we're not hearing the bullfrogs at a certain time during the spring. Um, it's alarming and disturbing, and also, in my opinion, accentuates the need for the kind of work that you do to actually put some hard numbers to that.
Well, one consequence, besides not having to clean your windshield, is that means that if there are these large declines of insects happening, as seems to be the case, insects provide not only ecosystem services like pollination, but insects are important food sources for lots of other insects and also for birds. And
Oh.
actually, bird watchers began to notice, oh, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago that bird numbers were declining, and in particular insectivorous birds, birds that rely upon insects for food. And there are some scientific studies that have shown that one reason for that is a temporal mismatch between when insects are available and when the birds need them. There's a really nice long-term study in the
Mm.
United Kingdom that showed that the timing of the hatching of caterpillars that eat oak leaves has changed much more quickly than the migration of the birds that used to time their migration to arrive just as or so that they were building their nests and hatching their young just at the time of peak caterpillar abundance.
Huh.
And that time of caterpillar abundance no longer matches up with when the birds need the caterpillars to feed their babies. And so that's one way that the insectivorous birds are suffering is because of that temporal mismatch. But another reason is just the decline in abundance overall of insects. So there are a number of birds that rely almost entirely on insects for food, and if the insects are disappearing, that means they're going to starve to death, and that seems to be going on. So there are a whole cascade of effects uh, that occur when something as important as insects disappear from an ecosystem.
Well, cascade is an interesting word to choose there because um, it's possible to see a cascade that ends in failure. And
That's
so
right.
and so here again, I'm trying to wrap my head around how to separate out what is sort of on the extreme of the conversation. The people who are waving their arms no matter what, from the reality. But you're suggesting that it is possible for decline of a sort of a keystone um, member of an ecosystem like insects to cause really serious impacts. Am I putting words in your mouth with that?
No, no, that's certainly the case, and uh, unfortunately, uh, we're not sure where this is going to end up. Maybe one happy note is the example of what happened when Rachel Carson wrote the book called Silent Spring to draw attention to the ecological consequences of widespread use of DDT. And it took a while for policymakers to act on that, but we now have a ban on the use of DDT here in the United States. Unfortunately, it is still used in some other parts of the world. But my guess is that we're going to see in the next few years a similar realization by policymakers that they need to do something about banning some of the other widespread pesticides that are being used rather indiscriminately, not just in this country, but around the world. So, for instance, one major category is a group called neonicotinoids, sometimes abbreviated as neonics. And almost all of the corn seeds, the soybean seeds, and the wheat seeds that are now planted in North America or in the United States are coated with these neonicotinoid pesticides before they're planted because they are what we call a systematic insecticide. They get absorbed by the seed, by the seedling as it germinates, and then the adult plant already has these neonicotinoids in it. And the idea behind this was that that would keep insects from eating the seedlings, from eating the adult plants, because they grew up with these pesticides in them. And there are now a lot of studies showing the negative impacts of these neonics on pollinators. They change their behavior, they change their lifespan, their ability to reproduce. And as that information is becoming more and more better and better understood, that's beginning to put more and more pressure on the regulatory agencies like the EPA in this country to restrict their use. A couple of years ago, regulators in Europe began to institute bans on some of these neonicotinoids because they were already beginning to realize the significant negative impacts of their use. And so my hope is that regulatory agencies in this country and in other parts of the world are going to follow the lead that some other countries have already taken in banning the use of these insecticides. And because these are generalist insecticides, they can have potentially an impact on both terrestrial insects and aquatic insects because those neonics, once they're in the soil, can get washed into aquatic ecosystems.
Well, which brings me to my question about that as you were speaking is what's the response time? If we were to stop using neonics tomorrow, how long do we have to deal with the effects that are already in play?
It would be not immediate because once they're in the environment, they do have a lifespan of at least a few years. We saw the same thing with DDT. It took a decade or more for the levels of DDT and its breakdown products to decline to the point where they were no longer thinning eggshells of birds like eagles. So we do know that there's a lag time. So the sooner that this legislation can be passed to restrict these neonics, the better off we're going to be in the long run.
And that means politicians have to go up against a multi-million or billion-dollar industry. So that's not a small task by any means.
That's true. That's true. I think that farmers are a bit of a bind here. They have become reliant upon chemicals like insecticides and herbicides and fungicides. But if you understand the way evolution works, then you understand how resistance to those chemicals can evolve very quickly. And so within just a few years, you begin to see weeds that are resistant to herbicides. You begin to see insects that are resistant to pesticides. And so there's this continuous evolutionary race that's going on between farmers and the pests that they're trying to prevent in their fields.
Well, yeah, and the amount of resources that have been invested in developing these products that then in a short period of time aren't effective. That's a big economic drain as well.
It is, but it does point to the importance of small-scale agriculture and organic agriculture. So, for instance, I'm fortunate enough to be living in the North Fork Valley of the Gunnison River, and this valley has the highest concentration of organic farms and orchards in the state of Colorado.
Mm.
And so these growers, and they're not commercial, large-scale growers. They're mostly small growers, have been able to. How do they grow crops organically in a way that makes them sustainable and provides them a living? So we know it can be done, but perhaps not at the large scale of some of these industrial scale agricultural efforts that have become very dependent on chemical pesticides and chemical insecticides and chemical herbicides, chemical fungicides.
Well, that brings up the idea that the task of figuring out what to do about this is very multifaceted, very complex. I mean, it involves how do we feed ourselves while we dial back on some of the things that we've become dependent on. But
It's a tricky question.
yeah,
And
and one that really requires a lot of high-level attention is sort of my point. And we've talked about some of those things. Legislation that could be passed, industry initiatives that could take effect. Let's flip that question over for a second, though. In your mind, what would you advise average people to do? I'm not going to be able to have the big picture effect, but what can I do to make a difference here?
well, there are a number of things you can do. As a small scale producer, if you're growing your own vegetables, growing your own fruits, you can do that in a way that minimizes or eliminates the use of herbicides and pesticides. There are things that you can do that will encourage pollinator populations in your yards by, for instance, planting flowers and different kinds of flowers that are going to bloom all season long and thereby provide the food source that pollinators need for the whole growing season.
Mm.
Even small scale farmers can do things like leave some land unplowed around the margins of their fields because there are a number of bees that nest underground, including bumblebees. And so if you're plowing your field once or more every year and turning all the ground over, where do the ground nesting bees get to nest? Um,
Hmm.
Some bees nest in wood, so leaving some dead trees around for those wood-boring bees and beetles to nest in. So there are a number of things that you can do in your yard or in small-scale farms to promote pollinator populations, either providing them with a place to live, or providing them with a food source, or protecting them from against pesticides.
Yeah, well, I think of my mom who lives in Houston, and her backyard every year is visited by monarchs. And so she gathers up all of the, the caterpillars and makes sure that they're protected. So that's tiny by comparison, but it's not nothing.
Well, there's an effort now to get people all over North America in areas where it's appropriate to grow milkweed to grow it in their yards and help provide that food resource that the migratory monarchs need. And so I have a friend who runs a program called Monarch Watch out of the University of Kansas, and they're now providing growers seeds, and they grow, I think it's tens, if not hundreds of thousands of milkweed plants every year, which they then send out to people to plant in their yards and their gardens. And so that's an effort that's a sort of effort that you can make on your own backyard. Even people who live in cities can do things. If you plant a small patch of flowers in your yard or maybe even in your balcony in a city, the pollinators will find those resources. And there are a couple of interesting studies now that have shown that yes, if the resource is there, the bees will find them and use them.
So the point is, things are being done. Things can be done. So don't be complacent. And as an average person, you can also get behind suggested legislation and policy changes that would make a bigger picture difference as well.
Yeah, there are a couple of organizations I mentioned. One was the Xerces Society, XERCES, the Xerces Society, which focuses on conservation of invertebrates, including pollinators. There's this group called Monarch Watch. It's based out of the University of Kansas. There's the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign, which has a website and has recommendations on its website, for instance, for eco-regional planting guides that would tell you, look up what's appropriate to grow in your yard for your part of the country. And so there are a number of ways that people can get information now about how to promote pollinators.
Okay, so find those ways and get involved. There's no
That's right.
excuse not to. David, thanks for the time and for the conversation. I've really appreciated having you on the show.
It's been a lot of fun.
Think Radio Presents is a production of Alan Mortis Media. The show's producer is Isa Forrest. Associate producer, Aaron Lewis.
Thanks for listening. Become a Think Radio Presents partner at patreon.com, and you'll also get access to premium content you won't find anywhere else. To leave a comment on today's show or to suggest a great story for a future episode, visit thinkradiopresents.com. Tune in next week for another great conversation on Think Radio Presents Think Planet.